Imagine standing in Westminster Abbey in 1396, watching as a heavy oak doors swing open for a royal wedding. The groom enters first. King Richard II of England, 29 years old, golden-haired, every inch a monarch. But then you see his bride, and your blood runs cold. She's not a young woman, not even a teenager. She's a child, 6 years old. Her tiny hand disappears completely inside his gloved palm. Her wedding dress is so heavy with jewels and embroidery that she can barely walk. This is Isabella of Valois. And in moments, this little girl playing dress-up will become Queen of England. Before you judge this as medieval barbarism, wait, because what happened next would shock even the hardened nobles of the 14th century. This child would outlive her husband, survive as a political prisoner, find true love, and die at just 20 years old after changing the course of European history forever. Welcome back to the Story Walls, where we uncover forgotten stories that shaped our world. I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of history's most controversial yet fascinating tales, the story of Isabella of Valois, the 6-year-old who became Queen of England. But before you click away thinking this is just another story of medieval cruelty, I need you to understand something. Isabella's story isn't just about child marriage or political manipulation. It's about a young woman who refused to be merely a victim of her circumstances. It's about finding love in the most unlikely places, about surviving when powerful men wanted you dead, and about leaving a legacy that would inspire generations of women to come. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll follow Isabella from the glittering but dangerous French court where a mad father sometimes forgot she existed, through her years as England's child queen, to her eventual return to France, where she would find both true love and an early grave. Before we dive deeper into Isabella's incredible journey, I want to know where you're watching from. Comment below and let's see how far around the world her story has reached. And if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of history, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Now, to truly understand Isabella's fate, we need to talk about the world she was born into. The year was 1389, and Europe was drowning in blood. The 100 Years' War between England and France had already consumed 2 generations. Entire regions lay in ruins. Noble families on both sides had bankrupted themselves funding endless military campaigns. The Black Death had swept through just 40 years earlier, killing half the population. In this world of constant death and political upheaval, children weren't allowed childhoods, especially royal children. They were chess pieces in a game where losing meant not just political defeat, but often death. Isabella would become the most valuable piece on the board. Picture the Louvre Palace on November 9th, 1389. In the royal chambers, Queen Isabella of Bavaria has just given birth to her first daughter. The midwives clean the baby and wrap her in cloth of gold, preparing to present her to the king. But there's a problem. Nobody knows which version of King Charles VI will walk through that door. Will it be Charles the Beloved, the cultured monarch who speaks 4 languages and governs with wisdom? Or will it be Charles the Mad, the man who sometimes runs howling through the palace corridors, convinced he's made of glass? On this particular day, the courtiers get lucky. The king is lucid, and he holds his newborn daughter with tears of joy streaming down his face. Isabella, he whispers, naming her after her mother. For a brief moment, it seems like this child might have a normal royal childhood. But those who know the king's condition exchange worried glances. How long will this lucidity last? The servants in the French palace had a secret code. When King Charles was having a good day, they would hang white banners from the windows. When madness took hold, the banners turned black. Little Isabella learned to read these signals before she could properly walk. On white banner days, she might find her father in the palace gardens, teaching her the names of flowers in Latin, bouncing her on his knee while discussing poetry with court scholars. He would shower her with gifts, tiny golden birds that sang when you wound them up, illustrated books of saints' lives, a miniature throne placed next to his in the Great Hall. But then the black banners would appear, and Isabella's world would transform into a nightmare. Servants would hustle her away as her father's screams echoed through the corridors. Sometimes he would forget he had a wife and children, demanding to know who these strangers were in his palace. Other times, he would cower in corners, begging invisible enemies not to hurt him. The most terrifying incident occurred when Isabella was 4 years old. She had been playing with her dolls in the palace nursery when she heard a commotion outside. Before her governess could stop her, she ran to the door and peeked out. There was her father, completely naked, running down the hallway while guards tried desperately to catch him. He was screaming that he was made of glass, and if anyone touched him, he would shatter into a million pieces. His eyes, those same gentle eyes that read her bedtime stories, were wild with terror. Isabella stood frozen as her father ran past, not recognizing his own daughter. When the guards finally subdued him, wrapping him in soft blankets and carrying him away, Isabella found she couldn't stop shaking. Her governess found her hours later, still standing in the same spot, tears streaming down her face. That was the day Isabella learned that even kings could be broken, and that madness was a shadow that could fall on anyone, even those you loved most. But Isabella's mother, Queen Isabeau, was made of sterner stuff, a Bavarian princess who had married into the French royal family at 14. Isabeau understood that showing weakness in the French court was a death sentence. With her husband increasingly incapacitated, she began to position herself as the real power behind the throne. And she looked at her beautiful, intelligent daughter not as a child to be protected, but as the most valuable card in her political deck. By the time Isabella turned 5, her mother was already receiving marriage proposals from across Europe. The King of Aragon wanted her for his eldest son. The Duke of Austria offered astronomical sums for a betrothal. But Isabeau was holding out for the biggest prize of all, a marriage that could end the catastrophic war with England. The Queen would spend hours staring at maps, moving carved pieces across painted territories like a master chess player. Here, she would say to her advisors, pointing at England, this is where Isabella's destiny lies. The negotiations began in absolute secrecy. French ambassadors, disguised as merchants, made their way across the English Channel, carrying proposals so audacious that many thought Isabeau had finally lost her mind. She was offering her 6-year-old daughter to King Richard II of England, a man of 29 who had just lost his beloved wife and a Bohemia to the plague. The age difference was shocking even by medieval standards. But Isabeau understood something her critics didn't. Richard II was that rarest of medieval monarchs, a man who preferred peace to war, art to combat, negotiation to bloodshed. He was also, whispers suggested, a man more interested in pageantry and beauty than in the physical aspects of marriage. If there was any king in Europe who might treat a child bride with genuine paternal care rather than seeing her as property to be possessed, it was Richard. The French ambassadors carried with them a miniature portrait of Isabella, painted by the finest artist in Paris. It showed a serious-faced child with dark hair and enormous brown eyes, dressed in a gown that made her look like a tiny adult. When the portrait reached Richard II in London, something unexpected happened. Courtiers reported that the king stared at it for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he did something that shocked everyone present. He kissed the portrait gently and said, "If this brings peace to our realms, then I will be a father to this child before I am a husband." But not everyone in England was pleased with the prospect of a French child queen. Richard's uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, slammed his fist on the council table when he heard the proposal. "Your Majesty means to take a baby for a bride?" he roared. "What use is a queen who won't be able to bear heirs for a decade or more?" Others worried about the message it would send, that England was so desperate for peace that it would accept a marriage that couldn't be consummated for years. But Richard had made up his mind. He had seen too much death, too much pointless destruction in the endless war with France. If marrying this child could bring peace, then he would do it, and he would ensure she was protected and cherished until she was old enough to be a true wife. Back in Paris, 6-year-old Isabella was being prepared for a destiny she couldn't possibly understand. Her tutors began teaching her English phrases. "Good morrow, my lord. It pleases me well. God save the king." She practiced walking in the heavy ceremonial robe she would wear for her wedding, stumbling under the weight of cloth of gold and ermine. Her mother supervised every detail, determined that her daughter would make a perfect impression. "You must not cry," Isabeau told her daughter sternly. "Queens do not cry. You must not show fear. Queens do not fear. You are going to be the most important woman in England, and you must act like it from the moment you leave France." Isabella nodded solemnly, trying to understand. She asked her governess what marriage meant, and the woman struggled to explain in terms a 6-year-old could grasp. "It means you will live in a beautiful palace across the sea," she said. "You will have English ladies to serve you and English foods to eat. And King Richard will take care of you like a very kind uncle." To understand why a 6-year-old girl will be sent across the sea to marry a stranger, we need to zoom out and see the blood-soaked chessboard of medieval Europe. By 1395, the 100 Years' War had become a generational curse. Imagine this. French knights who fought the English as young men were now watching their grandsons die in the same muddy fields. The war had started in 1337 over King Edward III's claim to the French throne, but by Isabella's time, nobody could remember what they were really fighting for anymore. All they knew was hatred, passed down like a poison inheritance. The English held vast swaths of French territory, Aquitaine, Calais, chunks of Normandy. French peasants lived under English rule, paying taxes to foreign lords who couldn't even pronounce their names correctly. Meanwhile, English nobles had spent so much gold financing endless campaigns that some were selling their ancestral lands just to equip another doomed expedition. Both kingdoms were bleeding to death, but neither could figure out how to stop. Here's what modern audiences often don't understand about medieval child marriages. They weren't primarily about sex or even producing heirs immediately. They were hostage exchanges dressed up in silk and ceremony. When you sent your 6-year-old daughter to marry a foreign king, you were essentially saying, "Here's proof I won't attack you. Would I wage war on a kingdom where my own child lives?" The younger the bride, the longer the peace might last. It was cruel mathematics. But in a world where the average life expectancy was 35 and where plague, war, or infected scratch could kill you tomorrow, waiting for children to grow up was a luxury few royal families could afford. Isabella wasn't the youngest royal bride in history. That dubious honor belonged to Isabella of France, who was betrothed at age 2. But she would become the most famous, because what happened to her after the wedding would shatter every convention of medieval politics. Yet in 1395, she was simply another pawn being positioned for a game whose rules were written in blood. So ends the extraordinary tale of Isabella of Valois, a story that began with a 6-year-old girl walking down the aisle of Westminster Abbey and concluded with a 20-year-old woman who had reshaped the political landscape of medieval Europe through sheer force of intelligence and will. In just 14 years, she transformed from a terrified child bride into England's queen, from a political prisoner into a diplomatic mastermind, from an exile returning to an unfamiliar homeland into a power broker whose influence stretched across continental politics. Her journey took her through 3 kingdoms, 2 marriages, and countless moments where a single wrong decision could have meant death or disgrace. Yet at each crucial juncture, Isabella chose courage over safety, principle over expedience, and hope over despair. She survived the madness of her father's court, the collapse of Richard's kingdom, the brutality of Henry's coup, and the chaos of French Civil War, not through luck or protection, but through her own remarkable capacity to adapt, learn, and grow stronger with each challenge she faced. Isabella's legacy reminds us that history isn't just about kings and battles, treaties and conquests. It's about individual human beings making impossible choices under unimaginable pressure and somehow finding ways to preserve their humanity in the process. Her story speaks to everyone who has ever felt powerless in the face of forces beyond their control, everyone who has had to rebuild their identity in hostile circumstances, everyone who has discovered strength they never knew they possessed when survival demanded it. She shows us that resilience isn't about never falling down. It's about getting up each time with more wisdom than before. Her life proves that even in the darkest periods of human history, when violence and cruelty seem to dominate everything, individuals can still choose compassion, intelligence, and moral courage. Isabella never commanded armies or conquered territories, yet her influence shaped the fate of nations. She never wrote philosophical treatises, yet her example taught lessons about human dignity that echo through the centuries. As we close this chapter of Isabella's remarkable story, I want to hear from you. What aspects of her journey resonated most strongly? Have you encountered situations where you had to find strength you didn't know you possessed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your perspectives often inspire future videos. If Isabella's story moved you, Please consider hitting that like button to help others discover the forgotten tales of courage and survival. And if you're hungry for more hidden stories from history's most turbulent periods, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. Your support makes it possible to continue uncovering these extraordinary human stories that traditional history often overlooks. When modern audiences first encounter Isabella's story, their immediate reaction often involves moral outrage at the concept of child marriage and political manipulation of minors. This response, while understandable, obscures the more complex questions her life raises about human agency, resilience, and the universal capacity to find meaning within circumstances beyond our control. Isabella wasn't simply a victim of medieval barbarism. She was an intelligent individual who consistently chose to maximize her influence within systems designed to minimize it. Her story challenges contemporary assumptions about childhood helplessness and adult protection by demonstrating how young people throughout history have navigated complex political situations with remarkable sophistication. Modern child psychologists studying Isabella's document responses to various crises note patterns of adaptive behavior that suggest emotional intelligence far beyond what current developmental models predict for children her age. Her ability to read political situations, form strategic alliances, and maintain psychological equilibrium during repeated traumatic experiences reveals cognitive and emotional capabilities that force us to reconsider what children can accomplish when circumstances demand adult-level problem-solving skills. The concept of agency within constraints that Isabella embodies speaks directly to contemporary struggles with systematic oppression and limited options. Her methods, building networks through cultural activities, using educational opportunities to develop political skills, maintaining dignity while accepting compromises, provide a blueprint for navigating situations where direct resistance seems impossible. Modern feminist scholars studying Isabella's career identify strategies that women in restrictive societies continue to employ. The cultivation of soft power through relationship building, the use of seemingly traditional roles as covers for non-traditional activities, and the patient accumulation of influence through competence rather than confrontation. Her example resonates particularly strongly with immigrants, refugees, and others whose circumstances force them to rebuild lives in unfamiliar systems while maintaining connections to their original identities. Isabella's transformation from French princess to English queen to French duchess demonstrates how identity can be fluid and adaptive without becoming false or opportunistic. Her story suggests that authenticity doesn't require rigid consistency, but rather the courage to grow and change while preserving core values. What makes Isabella's story universally relevant transcends the specific details of medieval politics to touch fundamental questions about human potential and personal responsibility. In an era when many people feel powerless in the face of global systems beyond their control, economic instability, political polarization, environmental crisis, Isabella's example provides evidence that individual agency remains possible even when structural constraints seem overwhelming. Her ability to influence international politics from positions of apparent powerlessness demonstrates how strategic thinking, cultural competence, and moral courage can create opportunities where none seem to exist. Modern leadership studies analyzing Isabella's documented decision-making processes identify qualities that remain relevant to contemporary challenges. The ability to see long-term consequences of short-term decisions, the skill to build coalitions across cultural and political divides, and the wisdom to recognize when compromise serves larger purposes better than absolute principles. Her story suggests that true leadership often emerges from learning to work within systems rather than attempting to overthrow them entirely. Perhaps most importantly, Isabella's life reminds us that historical figures were real people facing genuine dilemmas rather than distant symbols representing abstract political forces. Her documented emotions, the terror of leaving home at age 6, the grief over Richard's death, the joy of finding love with Charles, the fierce protectiveness toward her children, connect her experience to universal human feelings that transcend temporal and cultural boundaries. This emotional accessibility makes her story a powerful teaching tool for understanding how individual choices shape historical events and how personal courage can influence outcomes far beyond what seems possible given available resources. Her legacy challenges us to examine our own responses to constraint and adversity, asking whether we're making the most of opportunities within our circumstances or simply accepting limitations as unchangeable fate. In a world where young people often feel that major decisions about their futures are being made by others, Isabella's example demonstrates that even those with the least apparent power can find ways to influence their own destinies and contribute meaningfully to larger historical movements. Her story doesn't minimize the real obstacles she faced or suggest that individual effort alone can overcome systematic injustice, but it does provide evidence that human agency persists even in the most restrictive circumstances, and that the choices we make within our constraints can echo through generations in ways we never imagined. November 1409. As Isabella's funeral cortege winds through the streets of Paris toward the Celestine convent, few mourners realize they are witnessing the burial of a woman whose children will reshape European politics for generations to come. Joan, now barely 2 years old, toddles behind her mother's coffin clutching a wooden doll, unaware that she carries within her blood a legacy that will make her one of the most sought-after marriage prospects in Europe. Within a decade, she will become Duchess of Alsace through a union that will produce military commanders who will drive the English from French soil during the final phases of the 100 Years' War. Her marriage will bring together the Orleans political network with Normandy's strategic territories, creating an alliance that proves crucial to French victory at Castillon in 1453. But Joan's true achievement lies not in her battlefield connections, but in her development of what historians will later call the Isabella model, using royal status and intellectual training to build independent power bases that transcend traditional feminine roles. She establishes one of Europe's most important literary salons, patronizes scholars who advance Renaissance learning, and maintains diplomatic correspondence that influences papal policy during the Council of Basel. Isabella's son Charles grows into something unprecedented in medieval politics, a warrior poet whose military successes are matched by literary achievements that influence European culture for centuries. At age 16, he leads Orleans forces to victory at the Battle of Jargeau, demonstrating tactical brilliance inherited from his father and strategic patience learned from his mother's example. But his capture at Agincourt in 1415 transforms potential tragedy into unexpected triumph. During 25 years of imprisonment in England, Charles develops a body of poetry that revolutionizes European literature, introducing psychological depth and emotional complexity that anticipates Renaissance artistic developments by decades. His famous ballades, written in various English castles while negotiating his own ransom, contain coded political messages that maintain Orleans resistance networks throughout his captivity. When he finally returns to France in 1440, he brings with him not only military experience but also intimate knowledge of English court politics that proves invaluable in final negotiations ending the 100 Years' War. His marriage to Marie of Cleves produces a dynasty that will eventually claim the French throne, fulfilling Isabella's deathbed prophecy that her children's blood would outlive the kingdoms that sought to destroy them. Margaret, the child whose difficult birth hastened Isabella's death, becomes perhaps the most politically sophisticated of the three children. Raised by women who served Isabella during her diplomatic activities, Margaret absorbs lessons about international politics that transform her into Europe's most effective female negotiator. Her marriage to Richard of Étampes creates a power base in territories bordering English-controlled Calais, positioning her perfectly to serve as unofficial ambassador during peace negotiations that follow French military victories. Margaret's letters, preserved in various European archives, reveal a woman who inherited her mother's talent for seeing long-term political patterns while managing immediate crises. She successfully prevents several potential English invasions by convincing London merchants that war would disrupt profitable trade relationships, demonstrating how economic arguments could achieve what military threats could not. Her network of correspondence includes queens, abbesses, and noble ladies across Europe, creating what modern historians recognize as the first truly international women's political organization. When Margaret dies in 1466, her funeral is attended by representatives from 14 European courts, testimony to the diplomatic influence she wielded through relationships rather than formal authority. The broader impact of Isabella's example extends far beyond her immediate family into transformations of medieval political culture that historians are still documenting. Her demonstration that intelligent women could serve as effective political actors while maintaining traditional roles as wives and mothers provides a template that ambitious noble women across Europe begin to follow. The Isabella precedent. using cultural patronage as a cover for political networking, maintaining diplomatic correspondence under the guise of family connections, and building influence through intellectual rather than territorial means, becomes a standard strategy for women seeking to exercise power in male-dominated hierarchies. Queen Isabel of Portugal cites Isabella's example when justifying her own involvement in territorial expansion during the 1440s. Margaret of Anjou refers to Isabella's diplomatic methods when explaining her strategies during England's Wars of the Roses. Even Isabella of Castile, the future queen who will fund Columbus's voyage to America, studies accounts of the French Isabella's political career when developing her own approaches to international diplomacy. The ripple effects extend beyond noble courts into religious institutions, where abbesses begin adopting Isabella's methods of using cultural and educational activities to build political influence that transcends traditional ecclesiastical boundaries. Perhaps most significantly, Isabella's life story provides medieval chroniclers with a new narrative framework for understanding political events, one that emphasizes human agency and personal choice rather than divine destiny or masculine conquest. The chronicles describing her reign and subsequent career focus on decision-making processes, diplomatic strategies, and intellectual development rather than simply recording births, deaths, and military campaigns. This shift in historical perspective influences how later medieval writers approach biography and political analysis, creating literary traditions that will eventually contribute to Renaissance humanism and modern historical methodology. Isabella's story becomes a touchstone for arguments about women's intellectual capabilities, political rights, and social roles that will echo through European thought for centuries. When Christine de Pizan writes the Book of the City of Ladies in 1405, she includes Isabella among her examples of women whose achievements prove feminine equality with masculine intelligence. The philosophical implications of Isabella's career, that political authority derives from competence rather than gender, that diplomatic skill can achieve what military force cannot, that individual character matters more than inherited status, challenge fundamental assumptions about medieval social organization in ways that contribute to broader cultural transformations leading toward modernity. September 1409, the birth of Isabella's third child, Margaret, nearly kills her in ways that medieval medicine cannot understand or address. The delivery tears something vital inside her, leaving her body broken in ways that will never fully heal. For days after birth, Isabella drifts between consciousness and delirium, her fever climbing to dangerous heights while physicians debate bloodletting versus herbal remedies. Charles maintains a vigil beside her bed that becomes legendary among their household, refusing sleep or food while his wife battles for life. When Isabella finally awakens, her first words reveal the iron will that has carried her through every crisis. "Show me the letters that arrived while I was indisposed." Even childbirth cannot interrupt her political activities. But the woman who recovers from Margaret's birth is fundamentally changed, gaunt where she was once graceful, fragile where she was once resilient. Her cough, initially dismissed as a minor irritation, develops into something more sinister. Blood begins to appear on her handkerchiefs, though she hides this alarming development from everyone except her most trusted lady-in-waiting. The physicians speak in whispers about wasting diseases and corrupted humors, but their remedies prove useless against whatever is consuming Isabella from within. Despite her deteriorating health, Isabella refuses to retreat from the political battlefield that France has become. From her sickbed, she orchestrates a final desperate gambit to save the Orleans cause, a secret alliance with the Duke of Armagnac that could provide the military support Charles needs to defeat the Burgundians once and for all. The negotiations require her to travel to neutral territory for face-to-face meetings, journeys that leave her collapsed with exhaustion, but politically triumphant. Her ability to secure Armagnac support while gravely ill becomes the stuff of legend, inspiring stories about the dying queen who refused to abandon her family's cause. But the victory comes at a terrible cost. Each political success drains more of her remaining strength. Each journey brings her closer to complete physical collapse. By Christmas 1409, Isabella can barely walk unassisted, yet she continues to receive ambassadors, dictate letters, and plan strategies for conflicts she may not live to see resolved. Her children, now old enough to understand that their mother is dying, watch with bewildered terror as the woman who has been their anchor slowly fades before their eyes. The final weeks of Isabella's life unfold with the dramatic intensity of a Greek tragedy. She knows death is approaching. The blood she coughs up has increased dramatically, her appetite has vanished entirely, and her once sharp mind occasionally drifts into confused territories that remind her uncomfortably of her father's madness. But instead of preparing for death through prayer and contemplation, Isabella spends her remaining energy securing her children's future and the Orleans political position. She dictates a final letter to Henry IV that serves as both personal testament and political warning. Your Majesty will discover, perhaps too late, that the Burgundian alliance you have chosen will cost England more than the French territories you hope to gain. I pray that my children will live to see wiser counsel prevail in both our kingdoms. The letter is never sent. Isabella dies before it can be completed. Her final words lost to history, like so many other crucial communications that might have changed the course of European politics. On September 13th, 1409, just 4 days after her 20th birthday, Isabella of Valois breathes her last breath in Charles's arms, her death marking the end of one of the most remarkable political careers in medieval history. But even as her body fails, disturbing news arrives at Valois that will transform her death into something approaching martyrdom. English forces have landed in Normandy, beginning the invasion that Isabella spent her final years trying to prevent. March 1409. Isabella's private study at Blois has become an unofficial embassy where French civil war intersects with European diplomacy. Maps cover every surface, marked with color pins showing troop movements, allied territories, and potential invasion routes. Her correspondence has expanded beyond cultural exchanges into something approaching international espionage, with coded letters traveling to courts across Europe carrying messages that could reshape the balance of continental power. Isabella's unique position as former Queen of England makes her the only person in France capable of opening certain diplomatic channels, and she exploits this advantage with ruthless efficiency. Her letters to English nobles who once served her husband carry carefully crafted appeals disguised as personal reminiscences. I often think of the peace that blessed both our kingdoms during my brief time as your queen, and wonder if such tranquility might be restored through wise counsel rather than military adventure. The subtext is unmistakable. English intervention in France would be costly, bloody, and ultimately counterproductive. Some recipients respond with sympathy, others with suspicion, but all recognize that Isabella's voice carries weight that cannot be entirely ignored. The most dangerous aspect of Isabella's diplomatic activities involves her secret negotiations with Pope Benedict XIII, who has been trying to end the papal schism that has divided European Christianity for decades. Isabella recognizes that religious authority might provide leverage that military force cannot achieve, and she carefully cultivates papal support for the Orleans cause. Her letters to the Pope combine theological arguments with political calculations, suggesting that supporting the Orleans faction serves God's interests as well as the Church's temporal power. The Burgundian alliance with England, she writes in careful Latin, threatens to subordinate French Christianity to foreign influence, undermining the spiritual independence that your holiness has worked so tirelessly to preserve. The correspondence is dangerous because it potentially commits the Orleans family to positions on church politics that could create new enemies, but Isabella calculates that papal support might neutralize Burgundian advantages in other areas. When papal legates arrive secretly at Blois to discuss possible arrangements, Isabella finds herself negotiating agreements that would have challenged experienced diplomats twice her age. Isabella's most audacious diplomatic gambit involves direct contact with Queen Isabeau, her own mother, who has increasingly aligned herself with the Burgundian faction out of desperation to maintain some influence during King Charles VI's incapacity. The letters between mother and daughter carry emotional weight that transcends political calculation, but both women understand that family affection cannot overcome the brutal realities of civil war. My dearest daughter, Isabeau writes, your loyalty to your husband's family honors you, but it blinds you to larger necessities. The Orleans cause is lost. Charles cannot win against the combined power of Burgundy and England. Save yourself and your children while you still can. Isabella's response reveals how completely she has transformed from the obedient princess her mother once knew. Dearest mother, you mistake temporary advantage for permanent victory. The Burgundians may hold Paris today, but they hold it through alliance with foreign enemies who will demand payment in French territory and French independence. I choose a longer view, even if it requires immediate sacrifice. The exchange marks the final breakdown of family relationships, but also establishes Isabella as a political force willing to oppose even her closest relatives when principle demands it. The climax of Isabella's diplomatic efforts comes in autumn 1409, when she attempts to prevent renewed English intervention by offering Henry IV something unexpected: intelligence about French military capabilities in exchange for continued English neutrality. The negotiations take place through intermediaries who meet in secret locations along the French coast, their conversations carefully structured to avoid direct treason while accomplishing necessary political objectives. Isabella's proposal is audacious in its scope. England can avoid the enormous cost of French intervention while still gaining strategic advantages through carefully managed diplomacy. In exchange for remaining neutral in the Orleans-Burgundy conflict, Henry would receive detailed information about French weaknesses that could be exploited later through peaceful means. The offer reveals Isabella's sophisticated understanding of English interests and her willingness to sacrifice French secrets for Orleans' survival. But the negotiations also expose a fundamental weakness of her position. She can offer intelligence and diplomatic access, but she cannot offer the territorial concessions or military support that might truly satisfy English ambitions. When Henry's representatives finally reject her proposals, choosing instead to support Burgundian promises of English territorial gains, Isabella realizes that her diplomatic skills, however refined, cannot overcome the basic mathematics of medieval power politics. The failure of negotiations doesn't discourage her, but it does force her to confront the possibility that her family's survival may ultimately depend on military victory rather than diplomatic brilliance. June 1407. Isabella's first labor pains begin during a thunderstorm that seems to shake the very foundations of Blois Castle, as if nature itself is announcing the arrival of someone destined to reshape the political landscape. 24 hours later, she holds her daughter Joan, a perfect, healthy baby whose birth transforms Isabella from political pawn into fierce protector. Motherhood awakens something primal in Isabella that transcends the careful calculations she's learned to make about every aspect of her life. Looking into her daughter's eyes, she makes a silent vow that this child will have choices she never had, protection she never received, and the freedom to define her own destiny. But even as Isabella cradles her newborn, disturbing news filters into their sanctuary. The rivalry between the Orleans and Burgundian factions has escalated beyond mere political disagreement into something approaching warfare. Armed confrontations have broken out in Paris streets. Noble houses choose sides with increasing desperation. And King Charles VI's latest bout of madness has left the kingdom effectively without central authority. Charles returns from court visits with stories that chill Isabella's blood. Stories of midnight arrests, of noble families fleeing France under cover of darkness, a kingdom tearing itself apart, while foreign enemies circle like vultures. The assassination comes without warning on a November evening when Paris streets run slick with autumn rain and political blood. Louis of Orleans, Charles's father and Isabella's father-in-law, is murdered by Burgundian agents as he travels from a royal council meeting to his private residence. The killers strike with professional efficiency, cutting down the Duke and his bodyguards before melting back into a maze of medieval streets. News of the murder reaches Blois through riders who've changed horses multiple times to outrun pursuit, their message stark and terrible. The Orleans family is now marked for death. Civil wars become inevitable, and nowhere in France is safe for anyone bearing their name. Isabella receives this news while nursing Joan, and the contrast between maternal tenderness and political catastrophe creates a dissonance that will haunt her for years. In a single moment, she's transformed from a young mother enjoying domestic bliss into a war widow who must prepare for battles that will determine not only her own survival, but her daughter's future. Charles's grief over his father's murder burns itself into rage that frightens even Isabella, who has witnessed royal fury before. The cultured poet who charmed her with intellectual conversation becomes a military commander planning campaigns of vengeance with methodical precision. The months following Louis's assassination reveal Isabella's hidden talents as a political strategist and military organizer. While Charles leads Orleans forces in the field, she manages their territories from Blois with skill that impresses even hardened veterans of French court politics. Her correspondence networks, developed during her years of cultural patronage, become intelligence-gathering systems that keep Charles informed about Burgundian movements and noble loyalties. More crucially, Isabella uses her unique position as former Queen of England to open diplomatic channels that might prevent foreign intervention in France's civil war. She understands better than most how internal divisions invite external conquests, having witnessed firsthand how Henry Bolingbroke exploited English political weaknesses to seize Richard's throne. Her letters to various European courts carry warnings disguised as diplomatic pleasantries. France's current troubles represent opportunity for ambitious neighbors, but only if those neighbors are willing to risk the long-term consequences of French resentment. The subtle threats and careful inducements reveal a political sophistication that transforms Isabella from royal wife into power broker in her own right. The birth of Isabella's son Charles in October 1408 occurs against a backdrop of escalating violence that makes every moment of happiness feel stolen from an increasingly hostile world. The child arrives healthy and strong, his first cries mixing with the distant sounds of soldiers drilling in the castle courtyard below. Isabella, weakened by a difficult birth that nearly kills her, must delegate many of her usual responsibilities to trusted lieutenants while she recovers. But recovery proves elusive as disturbing reports arrive almost daily. Burgundian forces are advancing on Orleans strongholds. Several noble allies have switched sides or fled the country. And most ominously, English agents have been spotted in Burgundian camps. The possibility that Henry IV might intervene in French affairs on the Burgundian side fills Isabella with a terror that goes beyond political calculation. She knows Henry's character, understands his ambitions, and recognizes that an English invasion of France would likely succeed given the kingdom's current divisions. The irony is bitter. Her marriage to Richard was designed to prevent exactly the scenario, but Richard's death and her own exile have removed the diplomatic safeguards that might have preserved peace. As she holds her infant son and watches Charles prepare for another military campaign, Isabella realizes that everything she has built, her marriage, her family, her hard-won happiness, depends on winning a war that may already be lost. December 1405, the first time Isabella sees Charles of Orleans. He's arguing with a priest about the theological implications of courtly love poetry, his passion for debate making his dark eyes flash with intelligence and humor. At 29, he possesses a kind of mature confidence that makes teenage girls swoon and practical mothers calculate marriage advantages. But what catches Isabella's attention isn't his undeniable handsomeness or his reputation as one of France's most cultured nobles. It's the way he listens to opposing arguments with genuine interest rather than the barely concealed impatience she's learned to expect from powerful men. When their eyes meet across the crowded hall, something electric passes between them that has nothing to do with political calculation and everything to do with recognition. Here, finally, is someone who might see her as Isabella rather than as the former Queen of England. Their courtship unfolds with the careful choreography required by their elevated stations, but underneath the formal visits and supervised conversations, genuine attraction blooms into something approaching love. Charles treats Isabella as an intellectual equal, sharing his poetry and asking for her opinions on everything from philosophy to statecraft. The political implications of their potential marriage create ripples throughout the French court that quickly become tsunamis. Charles represents the Orleans faction, one of the most powerful noble houses in France, and a potential rival to royal authority. His father, Louis of Orleans, serves as regent during King Charles VI's periods of incapacity, making him effectively the most powerful man in the kingdom. A marriage between Charles and Isabella would unite the royal bloodline with the Orleans ambitions in ways that make other noble factions deeply nervous. The Burgundian party, led by John the Fearless, views the proposed union as a direct threat to their own influence. Late-night meetings proliferate in shadowy corners of noble houses, with whispered conversations about the need to prevent Orleans from becoming too powerful. Isabella finds herself once again at the center of forces beyond her control, but this time the stakes feel more personal. She has discovered the possibility of genuine partnership with Charles, and the thought of losing it to political maneuvering fills her with a desperation that surprises her with its intensity. When Charles formally requests her hand, Isabella's acceptance comes not from duty, but from desire, a dangerous luxury in the world of medieval politics. Their wedding on June 29, 1406, becomes a deliberate statement of Orleans' power and ambition. The ceremony takes place in the Cathedral of Notre Dame with a magnificence that rivals royal coronations, sending a clear message about Charles's status within the French hierarchy. Isabella, now 16 and possessed of a beauty that is mature beyond her years, walks down the aisle wearing a gown of midnight blue silk embroidered with silver stars, colors that represent the Orleans coat of arms rather than traditional bridal white. The symbolism isn't lost on anyone present. This marriage represents political alliance as much as personal choice. But when Charles and Isabella exchange vows, their voices carry a warmth and conviction that transcends diplomatic necessity. They look at each other with a kind of focused attention that makes observers feel like intruders on an intimate moment. The wedding feast that follows features entertainment that celebrates intellectual as well as martial virtues. Poets compete alongside knights. Scholars debate alongside musicians. And the bride and groom preside over it all with obvious delight in each other's company. The early months of marriage exceed even Isabella's cautious hopes. Charles's castle at Valois becomes their primary residence, a Renaissance palace where culture flourishes under Isabella's patronage and Charles's artistic vision. Here, far from the political pressures of Paris, they create a court that attracts the finest minds of their generation. Isabella commissions illuminated manuscripts, establishes a scriptorium where monks preserve classical texts, and maintains correspondence with scholars across Europe. Her experiences in England have given her unique insights into cultural exchange, and she uses this knowledge to foster intellectual dialogue between French and foreign courts. Charles, meanwhile, pursues his own literary interests while managing the vast Orleans territories with skill that suggests he inherited political acumen along with his artistic sensibilities. Their partnership extends beyond personal affection into genuine collaboration, with Isabella serving as advisor and confidant as Charles navigates the treacherous waters of French noble politics. But even in their private paradise, they cannot escape the gathering storm clouds that threaten to engulf all of France in civil war. September 1401. The Louvre Palace looms before Isabella like a magnificent prison she'd forgotten how to escape. 5 years in England have transformed her from a French princess into something unprecedented, a cultural hybrid who thinks in English, dreams in a mixture of languages, and carries herself with a particular brand of dignity that comes from surviving political catastrophe. Her mother, Queen Isabella, watches from the palace steps as Isabella's entourage approaches, calculating eyes measuring what sort of political asset has returned from across the channel. The reunion should be joyful, a mother embracing a daughter she hasn't seen since childhood. Instead, it feels like a negotiation between foreign powers. Isabella speaks to Isabella in rapid French, testing whether her daughter has retained fluency or become hopelessly anglicized. Isabella responds perfectly, but with an accent that marks her as forever changed. "Ma chérie," Isabella murmurs, but her tone suggests she's speaking to a stranger wearing her daughter's face. The real test comes when Isabella asks about her father. Isabella's expression darkens like storm clouds gathering over a battlefield. "He is unwell, more so than when you left. Perhaps it's better if you don't see him immediately." The warning proves inadequate preparation for what Isabella discovers when she finally encounters King Charles VI. The man who once bounced her on his knee while reciting poetry has become a hollow-eyed wraith who spends his days staring at walls, occasionally muttering about invisible enemies, or weeping for reasons no one can fathom. When Isabella approaches him in a royal solar, dressed in her finest gown and prepared to show how much she's grown, Charles looks at her with complete incomprehension. "Who is this child?" he asks his attendants, his voice carrying the petulant confusion of someone whose mind has become a maze with no exit. "Why does she look at me so strangely? Send her away. I know nothing of children." The rejection hits Isabella like a physical blow. She had prepared herself for political challenges, for court intrigue, for the complex maneuvering required to rebuild her life in France. She hadn't prepared for her own father to forget her existence. That night, alone in chambers that feel simultaneously familiar and foreign, Isabella weeps for the first time since leaving England. But these aren't tears of self-pity. They're tears of recognition that she truly is alone now, belonging fully to neither France nor England, responsible for creating her own identity in a world that insists on seeing her as either asset or liability. Queen Isabella wastes no time in beginning Isabella's re-education as a political tool. Within days of her return, Isabella finds herself attending strategy sessions disguised as family gatherings, listening as her mother and her advisors discuss how best to exploit her unique position. "Your English experience," Isabeau explains with characteristic bluntness, makes you valuable in ways you don't yet understand. You know their customs, their weaknesses, their fears. This knowledge could prove crucial as we navigate the changing balance of power in Europe. Isabella listens with growing unease as her mother outlines potential marriages that would align France with various European powers, each proposal calculated to advance French interests rather than Isabella's happiness. The Duke of Milan seeks a bride who could facilitate trade agreements. The King of Aragon wants an alliance against their mutual enemies. Most disturbing of all, there are whispers that Henry IV himself might seek to remarry Isabella to one of his sons, cementing English-French relations while neutralizing her as a potential threat. The conversations make Isabella feel like a chess piece being moved around a board by players who see her as valuable but expendable. The most chilling moment comes when Isabeau takes Isabella aside for a private conversation that reveals the full scope of her mother's ambitions. "You must understand," the Queen says, her voice carrying the cold precision of someone who has learned to view human relationships as political instruments, that your father's condition creates opportunities as well as challenges. The great lords of France grow bolder in their defiance of royal authority. They see a mad king and assume the crown is weak. But they underestimate the power of a queen mother who has learned to think strategically. Isabeau's eyes glitter with an intensity that reminds Isabella uncomfortably of her father during his worst episodes. Your English experience, your royal status, your intelligence, these are weapons we can use to restore French power and secure our family's future. But only if you're willing to put aside childish notions about love and happiness. The ultimatum hangs in the air between them. Isabella can have security and position within her mother's political machine, but only by surrendering any hope of controlling her own destiny. As autumn deepens into winter, Isabella realizes she has escaped one form of captivity only to discover another, perhaps more subtle but equally confining. February 1400. The news reaches Isabella's Tower prison through whispered conversations between guards who forget that children can be excellent eavesdroppers. King Richard II is dead, they say, though the circumstances remain deliberately vague. Official accounts speak of natural causes, of a former king who simply lost the will to live after losing his crown. But the servants who bring Isabella's meals exchange different stories in the corridors outside her chamber. Stories of Pontefract Castle, of suspicious circumstances, of a deposed monarch who knew too many secrets to be allowed a natural death. Isabella receives this news with the strange calmness that comes from having anticipated catastrophe so long that its arrival feels almost like relief. She has spent 6 months wondering when the other shoe would drop, and now it has. Richard is dead, which means she is officially a widow at age 10, a status that makes her simultaneously more valuable and more dangerous to England's new king. The political mathematics are brutally simple. As Richard's widow, she represents a potential rallying point for anyone nostalgic for the old regime, but as a child with no power base, she also represents an opportunity for Henry to demonstrate magnanimity by sparing an innocent. Henry IV's first personal meeting with Isabella reveals a man acutely aware of the delicate political theater he must perform. He enters her chamber accompanied by clerks and witnesses, transforming their encounter into a formal negotiation rather than a conversation between a king and a child. Henry's physical presence overwhelms the room. Where Richard had been elegant and artistic, Henry radiates the controlled violence of a professional soldier. His armor bears the dents and scratches of recent battles, and his eyes hold the calculating coldness of someone who has seized power through force and intends to keep it the same way. But when he addresses Isabella, his voice carries unexpected gentleness, as if he understands that terrorizing a child would serve no political purpose. "Your Grace," he begins, using her royal title deliberately, "we find ourselves in an unfortunate situation. Your marriage to my predecessor was a contract between kingdoms that no longer exists as originally conceived." The careful language cannot disguise the brutal reality. Isabella's entire life has been invalidated by Henry's coup, her status erased along with her husband's reign. The terms Henry offers reveal both cunning and cruelty disguised as mercy. Isabella may return to France with full honors, accompanied by her French attendants, and carrying a generous settlement that acknowledges her royal dignity. In exchange, she must formally renounce any claims to the English throne and publicly acknowledge Henry as Richard's legitimate successor. The proposal seems reasonable until Isabella grasps its full implications. Accepting these terms means admitting that her marriage was somehow invalid, that Richard's kingship was illegitimate, that her 3 years as Queen of England were based on a legal fiction. More personally devastating, it means abandoning any hope of justice for Richard's death or revenge against those who destroyed him. The 10-year-old girl who once practiced courtesy in the Louvre Palace must now choose between her conscience and her survival, between moral principles and political pragmatism. Henry's advisors watch her face carefully, clearly hoping to see the relief of a child grateful to escape an impossible situation. Instead, they see something that makes them deeply uncomfortable, the calculating expression of someone weighing options with adult sophistication. Isabella's response comes after days of deliberation that feel like years. She requests a private chapel service to pray for guidance, time alone to consider the spiritual implications of her choice, meetings with her French attendants to understand their perspectives. But everyone in the tower understands that these delays are political theater. Isabella is stalling while she processes the reality that her childhood is officially over, that she must make decisions that will echo through the rest of her life. When she finally provides her answer, it comes with conditions that surprise Henry's negotiators. She will acknowledge Henry as England's current king, but not as Richard's legitimate successor. She will renounce claims to the English throne, but not the truth about Richard's death. She will return to France, but she reserved the right to tell her story without interference. The careful phrasing reveals that Isabella has learned Richard's lessons about the power of language to preserve dignity even in defeat. Henry's acceptance of these terms reflects his own political calculations. Better to let a clever child return to France with face-saving compromises than create a martyr by keeping her imprisoned indefinitely. The journey back to France in summer 1401 becomes Isabella's final act as a character in English history. She travels not as a defeated prisoner, but as a young woman who has survived her first great trial and emerged with her intelligence and integrity intact. The ship that carries her across the channel bears witness to a remarkable transformation. The frightened 6-year-old who arrived at Calais 5 years earlier has become a sophisticated political actor who understands power, betrayal, and survival. Her French ladies-in-waiting, who have remained loyal throughout the catastrophe, speak of their relief at leaving England's dangers behind. But Isabella herself seems less relieved than thoughtful, as if she's already calculating how to use her hard-won wisdom in whatever challenges await her in France. The wind that fills their sails carries them toward a homeland that has changed as much as Isabella herself, toward a father whose madness has worsened, toward a mother whose political ambitions have grown more desperate. Most ominously, it carries him toward France where civil war between rival noble factions will soon make England's recent upheaval seem mild by comparison. Isabella may have escaped one collapsing kingdom, but she's sailing toward another, and this time she'll face the storms not as protected child, but as a young woman who must carve out her own path through the wreckage of medieval politics. Richard himself becomes a ghost, haunting his own palace. Isabella catches glimpses of him hurrying through corridors at odd hours, his usual magnificent robes replaced by traveling clothes, his golden hair disheveled as if he's been repeatedly running his hands through it. Their scheduled meetings are canceled without explanation, then rescheduled, then canceled again. When they do meet, Richard seems to be fighting some internal battle, starting conversations he doesn't finish, making promises he immediately contradicts. "You must remember," he tells her during one fragmented encounter, "that loyalty, that blood, that sometimes—" He stops mid-sentence, staring out the window toward the Thames as if expecting to see enemy ships materializing from the summer mist. Isabella watches him with growing alarm, recognizing in his distraction the same sign she learned to read in her father during his episodes of madness. But this isn't illness. This is a king realizing that his world is collapsing faster than he can shore up its foundations. When Isabella finally works up the courage to ask directly what's happening, Richard's answer chills her. "Henry Bolingbroke has landed at Ravensbourg with an army. My nobles are abandoning me like... He doesn't finish, but Isabella supplies the ending in her mind. Like rats from a sinking ship. The news that reaches Westminster becomes increasingly catastrophic as July turns to August. Henry's small force of exiled supporters has swollen to thousands as English lords flock to his banner. The Duke of York, who Richard trusted to defend the realm, has instead declared for Henry. Entire castles surrender without a fight, their garrisons switching sides as soon as Henry's forces appear on the horizon. Most devastating of all, the common people seem to welcome Henry as a liberator rather than an invader. Reports filter back to Westminster, cheering crowds greeting the returning exile, of prayers being offered in churches for his success, of popular songs celebrating the downfall of the tyrant Richard. Isabella listens to these reports with the dawning horror of someone watching a carefully constructed world reveal itself to be built on quicksand. Everything she thought she understood about English loyalty, about Richard's power, about her own security, proves to be an illusion sustained only by habit and fear. Now that fear has switched sides, and habit crumbles like ancient parchment exposed aflame. August 19th, 1399. Isabella awakens not to her usual gentle summons from French ladies-in-waiting, but to the harsh clatter of armor and urgent voices speaking English too rapidly for her sleepy mind to follow. Through her chamber windows, she can see the Thames dotted with boats moving purposefully downstream, carrying nobles and their household away from Westminster like debris scattered by a flood. Her guards, when she questions them, provide only cryptic responses. Preparations are being made for your grace's safety. The euphemism fools no one. Isabella may be only 10 years old, but she spent 3 years learning to decode the polite lies that mask political reality. Safety, in this context, means imprisonment. The Tower of London, which she can see from her windows like a stone prophecy, beckons with its ancient promise of containing threats to royal authority. She is about to become one of those threats, transformed overnight from queen consort to political liability. The irony isn't lost on her. The same fortress that has housed queens will now house a queen who might need to be silenced. The journey from Westminster to the Tower feels like a funeral procession, though Isabella isn't certain if she's a mourner or the corpse. Her traveling party has been stripped to the minimum, a handful of French attendants, guards whose loyalty remains questionable, and baggage that suggests a stay measured in months rather than days. The London streets, usually crowded with citizens eager to glimpse their young queen, are eerily empty. Shutters remain closed, doors stay barred, and the few people visible hurry past without making eye contact. News of Henry's advance has reached the capital, and the citizens of London are making their own calculations about which side to support. Isabella's litter, which once drew cheers and flower petals, now travels through a city that treats her passage like a plague cart making its rounds. When they reach the tower's gates, she hears them clang shut behind her with a finality that resonates in her bones. The fortress that has guarded England's kings for 3 centuries now guards against its queen. Her apartments in the tower are comfortable by medieval standards, tapestries to ward off dampness, braziers to provide warmth, furnishings that suggest honor rather than punishment. But the bars on the windows transform luxury into elegant captivity, and the guards posted outside her door serve purposes beyond protection. Isabella quickly learns the new rules of her existence. She may walk in designated areas at specified times. She may receive approved visitors under careful supervision, and she may correspond with no one without explicit permission. Her French ladies whisper among themselves about rumors reaching the tower. Richard has been captured in Wales. His remaining supporters have surrendered or fled. Henry Bolingbroke now controls most of England. But these rumors come third-hand and distorted, leaving Isabella to piece together the collapse of her world from fragments and whispers. The uncertainty proves almost worse than confirmed catastrophe. At least knowledge, however terrible, provides a foundation for planning. Ignorance leaves her suspended between hope and despair, unable to prepare for whatever comes next. Richard's final visit comes 3 weeks after Isabella's imprisonment, and the man who enters her chamber bears little resemblance to the king who once showered her with gifts and paternal affection. His clothes are travel-stained and ill-fitting. His hair has been roughly cut, and his hands shake with what might be fear or rage or simple exhaustion. Most shocking of all, he comes alone. No guards, no attendants, no ceremonial trappings of kingship. For the first time in her life, Isabella sees Richard not as a monarch, but as a desperate man facing his own mortality. Their conversation takes place in the growing twilight, with shadows lengthening across the chamber like prophecies of approaching darkness. Richard's words come in disjointed fragments, as if he tries to compress years of explanation into minutes. Henry claims the nobles have abandoned You must understand that I never intended. Isabella listens with the focused attention of someone who knows she's receiving final instructions from a drowning man. When she finally speaks, her question cuts through his rambling with devastating directness. Are you still king? The silence that follows stretches until Richard's laugh breaks it, bitter, broken, utterly without humor. Ask me tomorrow, he says, and the answer might be different. But Isabella's most important lesson comes from observing the delicate relationship between Richard and his nobles. She begins to notice patterns. How certain lords fall silent when a king enters a room. How others speak just loudly enough for Richard to overhear their conversations. How alliances shift with each royal decree. The Duke of Gloucester, Richard's uncle, particularly fascinates and frightens her. His public displays of loyalty seem too elaborate, too performative, like an actor playing a role he doesn't believe in. During one memorable feast, Isabella watches Gloucester toast Richard's health with words that sound like praise but feel like threats. To our sovereign lord, whose wisdom guides England through these challenging times. The pause before challenging hangs in the air like a sword, and Isabella sees Richard's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. That night, she asks Margaret what happens to kings who lose the support of their nobles. Margaret's answer chills her blood. They stop being kings one way or another. The conversation takes place in Isabella's private chapel, but even there, they speak in whispers, aware that walls have ears and that knowledge itself can be a death sentence. The protective bubble surrounding Isabella begins to show cracks in late 1398, though she doesn't recognize the signs at first. Richard's behavior becomes increasingly erratic. One day showering favorites with lands and titles, the next ordering their execution for imagined slights. His generosity toward Isabella remains constant, but she notices new layers of security around her daily routines. Additional guards appear at her door. Her correspondence with France is delayed for review. Most tellingly, certain courtiers who once sought her favor now avoid her entirely, as if association with the French queen has become dangerous. Margaret, with her keen political instincts, recognizes these warning signs before Isabella does. Something is coming, she tells Isabella during a particularly tense evening. The older nobles whisper about Henry Bolingbroke more than they should. They speak his name like a prayer or a promise. Isabella doesn't understand the significance of this until Margaret explains. Henry is Richard's cousin, recently exiled for treason, but rumored to be gathering supporters in France. The irony is bitter. While Isabella has been learning to become English, her homeland may be harboring the man who will destroy everything she's built. The illusion of safety finally shatters during the Christmas celebrations of 1398. Isabella, now 9 years old and fluent in complex choreography of court life, notices that several prominent nobles are absent from the festivities without explanation. Those who remain seem nervous, their laughter forced, their conversations carefully neutral. Richard himself appears oblivious to the tension, or perhaps he's simply choosing to ignore it. He lavishes gifts on Isabella, a jewel cross from a holy land, rare books illuminated by Flemish masters, a miniature crown crafted specifically for her growing head. But that night, as Isabella kneels in her private chapel saying prayers for her family in France, she overhears two guards discussing disturbing news. Ships have been spotted in the Channel, flying banners that no one can identify. More ominously, several coastal lords have failed to send their usual reports to Westminster. Margaret finds Isabella pale and shaking the next morning. "What did you hear?" she asks urgently. When Isabella repeats the guard's conversation, Margaret goes white. "Henry Bolingbroke," she whispers. "He's coming home." The two girls stare at each other in the cold morning light, both understanding that Isabella's carefully constructed life as Queen of England is about to be tested by forces beyond her control or comprehension. The golden years of her childhood reign are ending, and neither Richard's protection nor her own growing political skills may be enough to save her from what's coming. July 1399. Westminster Palace feels like a ship taking on water, though the disaster isn't immediately visible to those aboard. Isabella first notices something wrong when her morning routine is disrupted by hushed conferences between her guards. Then Margaret Holland disappears without explanation, simply gone from her chambers one morning, leaving behind half-finished embroidery and a hastily scrawled note. "Trust no one. Burn this. The note's urgency terrifies Isabella more than its words. Margaret never acts without calculation, never writes anything that could compromise her. If she's fled Westminster, something catastrophic must be approaching. Isabella burns the message as instructed, but its ash-black fragments seem to prophesy the fate awaiting everyone in the palace. That afternoon, she discovers that 3 of her English ladies-in-waiting have also vanished, their rooms stripped bare as if they never existed. When Isabella asks the remaining French attendants about these disappearances, they exchange meaningful looks and speak only in rapid, nervous French. Les rats abandonnent le navire coule. Rats abandon sinking ships. The transformation of Westminster from royal palace to fortress happens with breathtaking speed. Armed guards appear at every doorway, their faces grim with purpose rather than ceremonial duty. Courtiers who once lingered in hallways chatting about poetry and music now scurry past each other without making eye contact, as if conversation itself has become treasonous. The great hall, usually filled with the laughter and music of evening entertainment, falls silent except for the echo of nervous footsteps and whispered conversations that stop abruptly when anyone approaches. Isabella finds herself increasingly isolated, her request to visit certain parts of the palace met with polite but firm refusals. "For your safety, your grace," the guard explained, but their eyes suggest a different truth. She is no longer a queen to be protected, but a prisoner to be contained. When she asks to send a letter to her mother in France, the response comes after suspicious delays. All correspondence must be reviewed for security purposes. Isabella understands. She is being cut off from the outside world, prepared for whatever storm is about to break over England. The coronation ceremony itself takes place in Westminster Abbey before an audience that includes representatives from across Europe, all eager to witness this unprecedented moment in royal history. Isabella processes down the aisle wearing robes so heavy she needs assistance walking, her train carried by duchesses who have been carefully chosen to represent different factions of the English nobility. The ceremony follows ancient traditions dating back centuries, but everything feels strange when applied to a child. When the Archbishop of Canterbury places a crown on Isabella's head, he must hold it steady to prevent it from slipping. When she receives the orb and scepter, symbols of royal authority, her small hands can barely grip them. The most surreal moment comes when Isabella must swear the coronation oath, promising to govern England with justice and wisdom. Her clear child's voice echoing through the vast abbey as she vows to defend the realm against all enemies seems to mock the very idea of royal authority. Yet something magical happens as the ceremony progresses. Isabella rises to meet the moment, her dignity and composure transform the potentially ridiculous into something genuinely moving. By the time the final God Save the Queen rings out, even the most cynical observers find themselves believing, at least temporarily, in the power of this extraordinary child. But outside the Abbey, London is counting its dead. The official records will later claim that only 3 people died in the crush to see Isabella's coronation, but witnesses put the number much higher. Families who travel from distant villages to celebrate their new queen return home, carrying the bodies of loved ones trampled into chaos. The symbolism is lost on no one. Isabella's reign has begun with bloodshed, an omen that even the most superstitious take seriously. More ominously, reports reached the court that several prominent English nobles who oppose the French marriage have used the coronation as cover for secret meetings. While Isabella was taking her vows in Westminster Abbey, her enemies were already plotting her downfall. The child queen has survived her first great test, but the real trials are yet to come. As she sits at the coronation feast, still wearing her crown and trying to stay awake through seemingly endless toasts to her health, Isabella has no idea that Richard's cousin Henry Bolingbroke is already in exile, gathering supporters and planning his return. The golden afternoon of her coronation will prove to be the highest point of her English adventure. From here, everything descends into darkness. Westminster Palace, autumn 1397. 8-year-old Queen Isabella awakens each morning in apartments that once belonged to Eleanor of Aquitaine, surrounded by tapestries depicting conquering heroes and fallen kingdoms. Her French ladies-in-waiting dress her in miniature versions of adult court gowns, each outfit a small masterpiece of silk and velvet that costs more than most nobles spend in a year. But Isabella's real education begins when she steps outside these chambers into the labyrinthine world of English court politics. Her first tutor is Master Geoffrey, a clerk who served 3 previous kings and whose weather hands shake as he unfurls maps showing territories that have changed hands a dozen times in living memory. "Your Grace must understand," he tells her, pointing to contested borders, "that every alliance in this kingdom depends on who holds power today, not yesterday." Isabella listens intently, her dark eyes following his finger across parchments that chart not just geography, but a rise and fall of noble houses. She doesn't yet realize that Master Geoffrey is teaching her survival skills disguised as history lessons. The most dangerous hour of Isabella's day comes during the evening meal in Westminster's Great Hall. Here, beneath soaring Gothic arches and banners celebrating English victories over France, she must navigate conversations laden with hidden meanings and subtle threats. The English nobles watch her constantly, analyzing every gesture, every word, searching for signs of French sympathy or disloyalty. Lord Arundel, a grizzled veteran of French campaigns, delights in testing her with seemingly innocent questions about her homeland. "Tell me, Your Grace," he might say while carving his meat with deliberate precision, "do you miss French wine? I've heard it's superior to our English varieties." Isabella has learned to recognize these traps. Too much nostalgia for France marks her as potentially treacherous. Too little suggests she's ungrateful for her upbringing. Her responses must be perfectly calibrated. "My lord, I find that loyalty makes any wine sweet, and betrayal turns even the finest vintage bitter." The nobles exchange glances, unsure whether to admire her cleverness or fear it. Meanwhile, Isabella continues eating, her face betraying nothing of the exhaustion these verbal duels cause her. Richard himself provides the only genuine sanctuary in this maze of political calculation. Their private meetings, held in a solar overlooking the Thames, reveal a side of the king that the court rarely sees. Here, away from watching eyes and listening ears, Richard becomes something approaching a father figure. He brings Isabella books from his personal library, not just a devotional text deemed appropriate for young ladies, but chronicles of great queens who shaped history through intelligence rather than bloodlines. "Read about Eleanor of Aquitaine," he tells her, his voice soft with something that might be genuine affection. "She ruled half of Europe through wit alone. Birth gave her opportunity, but brilliance made her legendary." These sessions stretch for hours, with Richard sharing insights about kingship that he trusts to no one else. He explains how to read the faces of courtiers, how to distinguish genuine counsel from flattery, how to project strength when feeling vulnerable. But there's something desperate in his teaching, as if he's trying to prepare her for trials he can see approaching but cannot name. Isabella's most crucial relationship develops with Margaret Holland, daughter of Richard's half-brother and one of the few people at court close to her own age. Margaret, at 10, possesses the kind of worldly wisdom that comes from growing up surrounded by political intrigue. Their friendship begins cautiously. Both girls understand that every relationship at court carries political implications. But gradually, trust develops between them, forge and share experiences of being young women in a world controlled by ambitious men. Margaret becomes Isabella's guide to the unspoken rules of English court life, teaching her which servants can be trusted with secrets, which nobles harbor grudges against the French alliance, and which ladies-in-waiting report private conversations to their own patrons. "Never write anything you wouldn't want proclaimed in Westminster Hall," Margaret warns during one of their walks in the palace gardens. "And never trust anyone who claims to have no political interests. Those are usually the most dangerous of all." Their conversations, conducted in whispers while embroidering or playing chess, reveal the sophisticated intelligence networks that even children must navigate in medieval royal courts. October 31st, 1396. The ancient fortress of Calais stands like a stone sentinel between two worlds, its English banners snapping in the bitter Channel wind. Inside the castle's great hall, 7-year-old Isabella of Valois shivers in her wedding gown, a creation so magnificent it seems designed to overwhelm rather than adorn her tiny frame. The dress weighs nearly 30 pounds, cloth of gold interwoven with pearls, each thread worth more than most peasants see in a lifetime. Her French ladies-in-waiting fuss around her like nervous birds, adjusting her veil, straightening her miniature crown, whispering prayers in their native tongue. But Isabella's enormous dark eyes are fixed on the doors at the far end of the hall, where her bridegroom waits. She has never seen King Richard II in person, only the portrait that hangs in her mother's chambers. Will he be kind? Will he be gentle? Or will he be like her father during his dark episodes, a stranger wearing a familiar face? As a massive oak door swing open with a groan that echoes through the centuries, Isabella takes her first step toward a destiny that will span 3 kingdoms and end in tragedy. The ceremony itself unfolds like a fever dream. Richard II enters wearing robes of deep purple velvet, his golden hair catching the candlelight, moving with the fluid grace of a man born to command. But when he sees Isabella, something unexpected happens. He stops dead in his tracks. For a moment that stretches into eternity, the King of England stares at this child who is about to become his wife, and witnesses later swear they see tears glittering in his eyes. Perhaps he's thinking of his own childhood stolen by the crown, or perhaps he's simply confronted with the full reality of what this alliance demands. But then the moment passes, and Richard transforms into the consummate royal performer. He approaches Isabella with careful, measured steps, drops to one knee, so they're eye level, and speaks the only French words he's learned for this occasion. Ma petite reine, my little queen. Isabella, coached for months in proper protocol, curtsies so deeply she nearly topples over. The assembled nobles from both kingdoms watch this bizarre courtship unfold, many wondering if they're witnessing history in the making or the beginning of a catastrophe. The vows they exchange in that cold stone hall are unlike any wedding ceremony in royal history. Traditional marriage rites speak of physical union, of becoming one flesh, of the duties husband and wife owe each other. But these words have been carefully edited, sanitized, transformed into something more resembling an adoption ceremony than a wedding. Richard promises to protect Isabella until she reaches the fullness of womanhood. Isabella, in her piping child's voice, promises to learn the ways of England and serve its people faithfully. The rings they exchange are symbolic rather than binding. Isabella's is too large for her finger and must be worn on her thumb. When Richard lifts her veil for the ceremonial kiss, he pauses again, seeming to struggle with the moment. Finally, he places the gentlest possible kiss on her forehead, as a father might kiss a daughter goodnight. The French contingent exhales collectively. Their princess has survived her first test, but the English nobles exchange troubled glances. Their king has just married a child in a ceremony that feels more like political theater than sacred ritual. What happens when the play acting ends? The wedding feast that follows reveals the deep tensions underlying this diplomatic marriage. Isabella sits at the high table beside Richard, her feet dangling from a chair designed for adults, picking at delicacies she doesn't recognize while conversations swirl around her in languages she's still learning. Richard, meanwhile, seems to retreat into himself, answering questions with polite monosyllables while his eyes remain distant, unfocused. The French and English nobles eye each other across the hall, like rival armies maintaining an uneasy truce. Wine flows freely, loosening tongues and revealing the doubts many harbor about this arrangement. The king has lost his mind, mutters one English lord to his companion. What use is a queen who won't be fit for royal duties for another decade? But these whispered criticisms reach the wrong ears. By midnight, several English courtiers have been quietly arrested on charges of treasonous speech, and the celebration takes on a distinctly sinister undertone. Isabella, exhausted by the day's events and overwhelmed by the adult emotions swirling around her, falls asleep at the table, her small head resting against Richard's arm. The image, a grown man in royal robes with a sleeping child bride, becomes seared into the memory of everyone present. But the Calais ceremony is merely a prelude to the real spectacle. 8 months later, in June 1397, London prepares for Isabella's coronation as Queen of England. This time, there will be no intimate diplomatic gathering. Richard has decided to stage the most magnificent royal pageant in English history, partly to celebrate his new queen, but mostly to demonstrate his power to the increasingly restless English nobility. The preparations take months and cost a fortune the realm can barely afford. Goldsmiths work around the clock to create a crown that will fit Isabella's small head. Seamstresses embroider robes that will train behind her for 20 feet. Street performers and musicians are imported from across Europe. The menu for the coronation feast includes 400 oxen, 1,200 sheep, and countless exotic delicacies shipped in from the continent. But Richard's obsession with spectacle has a darker purpose. He intends the celebration to be so overwhelming, so magnificent, that it will silence his critics through sheer awe. He doesn't realize that many see this extravagance not as a show of strength, but as evidence of a king who has lost touch with reality. The day of the coronation dawns gray and drizzly, but that doesn't dampen the excitement of the London crowds. Word is spread throughout the kingdom about their unusual child queen, and people have traveled from across England to catch a glimpse of her. The procession from the Tower of London to Westminster Abbey becomes a human river flowing through the narrow medieval streets. Isabella rides in a litter decorated with white roses and blue fleur-de-lis, visible to crowds through gauze curtains. She has grown during her months in England, not just physically, but in confidence and poise. The terrified child of Calais has been replaced by a young girl who waves graciously to the cheering masses, who has learned to smile on command, who understand that she is now part of a performance that never ends. But the crowd's enthusiasm proves deadly. As the procession nears Westminster, the narrow streets become dangerously packed. People climb onto rooftops, hang from windows, press forward in their desperation to see the legendary child queen. Barriers collapse under the pressure. Strong men are lifted off their feet by the surging crowd. And then the unthinkable happens. People begin to fall, to be trampled, to die in the very celebration meant to honor their new queen.